Before I start the next presentation, let's review a few things from yesterday and the day before. Yesterday, I introduced focus, frame, and shoot. We watched a video demonstrating how to use focus lock and then how to frame the shot or compose the shot so that the subject is placed to the side and not in the center, and then to press the shutter button down to shoot. So when you think of focus lock, pressing your shutter button halfway down so that the green box appears on the LCD screen on your computer. That green box is presetting the focus, and we usually do that with the subject in the center. And then you move the camera slightly to reframe where the subject is placed so that the subject is off to the side or placed asymmetrically. So that's framing the shot. Then you're ready to shoot it. I'd like us to think about focus, frame, and shoot when we compose our photos for our unit. A couple days ago we talked about symmetry and asymmetry as a way to determine if an image is visually pleasing. And arguments can be made for both symmetry and asymmetry. Some people prefer symmetry with the object or subject of our photos or in a painting to be right in the center, and some people prefer those objects or subjects to be off-center or asymmetric in the frame. I am persuading you to consider placing your subjects asymmetrically in the frame of the camera as a way to get us to think of the rule of thirds later, which will be another presentation down the line. Also, we've talked about focal point, and think of the word focus and focal there. Focal point is a point or place on the frame or in the frame that pulls us in, draws our attention. Just using the slide, for instance, I'm using the shape of the oval and the color red to draw our eyes or pull our eyes to that place, so we look at the word review. So that is our focal point for this slide. If we look at this image, you notice a frame in there. I guess that's our focal point in this image. But I'd like to use it to compare how our eyes view the world compared to how a camera views the world. Our eyes tend to have a very wide field of vision, and a camera is constrained or restricted to that frame or that box. And I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but when I've been on a trip or on a vacation and I come across a scene that looks beautiful, I want to take a picture of it, I take a picture of it, and then when I review it later, I'm let down or disappointed because when I look at the picture, I don't feel like that's what I really saw. It doesn't have the full effect. And that's because one reason our eyes can perceive depth much better than a camera does. A camera tends to flatten the way the world looks compared to how our eyes look at the world. And the fact that that rectangle or frame is a big limitation to what can be composed in a photograph. Now, concerning focal point, this photo, looking at the clouds, the sky, the sand, the palm tree, doesn't really have a dominant focal point. Some people might say the clouds is the focal point. But as I'm looking through this picture, I'm kind of drawn away to the sides a little bit, but then I don't feel like I'm pulled into this picture. There isn't much there, and I'd like to be at that place right now at the beach, but it isn't drawing me in compositionally. So how do we get the viewer to forget the frame? Or another way to say this, how do we pull the viewer into our pictures that are constrained by the fact that we have a box or a frame to look at? Well, I'm going to show you an image where I've put a subject or object inside of the frame, and I want you to see if you notice your eyes being pulled in. Now, it's a little cheesy. It's like I photoshopped this in. So here we go. Now, when I place the cruise ship in there, I believe that the eyes are pulled into the frame there, and it makes me want to look at the ship a little bit. And I tend to forget that there is a frame or a box around this. I'm kind of pulled in. Well, besides focal point, yesterday we also briefly mentioned elements. Elements are the basic building blocks of, in this case, photography. If we look at this slide, the basic elements of this slide are the pieces of text, the color red, and the shape. And we've got a lot of empty space in white. And those are kind of the elements that I notice on this slide. Well, elements can be more than that. We'll be introducing different elements, but we have talked about that lines and shapes and colors and tones, things like focal points. Those are elements that help build a good photo. But there's a very important element that I would like to introduce today, and that's called negative space. Let me get to that slide. All right, so we're going to talk about negative space as an important element to a photograph. It's also an important element to drawing the eyes in or pulling the eyes into a photo. Now, negative space is sometimes called white space, but I'm not trying to be confusing, but it's often depicted in black, so go figure. I'll try to just stay with negative space. Just be aware that some people call it white space. While we're talking about this, I want us to also think about that our eyes tend to lock on the familiar, but a photographer tries to look at the familiar in an unfamiliar way. So I'm trying to help you see a little bit differently, see images and potential pictures as a photographer would. And to help us do that, I need to go through negative space. What I'd like you to do is get out a piece of scratch paper, and I'd like you to just draw the line right here. So between the black and the white, just kind of draw this out. Don't worry about being perfect, but just kind of trace it out. And when you're done, you can unpause the video. So pause right now. All right. Now I'd like you to flip your drawing over, and I'm going to flip my slide over, and I can see a dog in the white, and I can see a cat in the black on the right. And what I'm showing you is kind of a trick that artists use, some artists use, to help them focus on lines and shapes and not on the form that they're familiar with, in a way to draw better. So drawing upside down, drawing objects or subjects upside down, helps an artist pay attention to certain things in a painting or in a sketch. And for a photographer, we can borrow that same trick. Let's look at this image. This is upside down, but we can tell that it's arm and a hand, and we've got a person there, and it looks like the moon. And I'm going to flip this. Give me a second here. And when I do this, we still recognize our subject, our positive space. But look at the negative space. That moon turns into an eye, and it looks like something is going to, this creature is going to swallow this person. So a negative space influences our positive space. I'm going to show you some examples of that. Now here I can tell you that the focal point, you probably would agree, that the focal point probably is the subject in red at the bottom right. And I used the shape of these words together to also direct the eyes down to the bottom right. But look at all this empty or negative space. This negative space has a way of pulling our eyes also towards the word subject. When we look at this, you notice that there's a gap here between the two chunks of text. And let's call this a river of negative space. This river of negative space, this empty space, influences our eyes to look in this area. Well, let's switch over to photography now. Here's an example of a toddler. You'll notice that the background in the top picture is blurred out. And this blurred out background, actually, this negative space, helps emphasize the shape and details of the toddler. Let's look at this one. Now, that beetle is bright green, and that draws us, just by the color, in this stem or branch, whatever he's crawling on here. That's also leading our eyes to pay attention. But the power of the negative space also brings us to this area. This blurred out background kind of pushes our eyes towards the right side. You'll see in this year's yearbook that a lot of pictures are cut out. And for example, these people, the picture that was taken, there was probably other players in the background, or who knows what was in the background. But we cut people out and put them in the yearbook so that we can emphasize our subject more. Well, that's the idea of negative space helping to bring more attention to the subject. When you look at this image, it's upside down. And I did this on purpose so that we would notice something that our eyes tend to do. Our eyes tend to notice or lock onto what's familiar. And when they do that, they tend to ignore what's in the negative space or the background. So in this case, with it upside down, we can recognize that it's a bird, but we also notice equally, I think, how distracting or how complicated that background is. Now let me flip it, and I want you to notice how your eyes will lock into the bird. So in this one, our eyes tend to lock onto the familiar, almost to the point where we don't consider how distracting the background is, but it really is. Let's take a look at this one. Here we have a portrait. Seems okay. Some people might even say that the tree forms lines that point to the subject, but when we look at it upside down, I think we notice that, wow, those branches of the tree almost dominate this picture more than the intention of bringing out the person. And so let me switch that back again. When I look at it now, it seems like the branches are growing out of her, and this is sometimes called a merger. The subject in the back, this flattening effect of the camera makes it appear that the branches are coming out of her, and to me now it seems a lot more distracting when I looked at it upside down. So a busy background can often result in a distracting background. A busy background is negative space that does not help draw attention to the subject. So when you're taking pictures, we want you to think about the background as much as you're thinking about your subject, because you want to think about, does the background help or does it hurt bring attention to our subject? And our subject is our focal point. So when we look at this picture again, I'd like you to consider that this background makes it a little bit more difficult to concentrate on the bird. Not impossible, but I don't think it's helping as much as it is hurting. So we need to make our subject stand out from the crowd. And one way I could do it in this picture is to create a focal point by drawing an oval around one person, and our eyes zoom in over there. And you did this on your newsletter. You created a box at the top of your newsletter project, and that box kind of helped draw the eyes to the top. But we don't want to do this for photos. We don't want to create boxes and ovals to help people pay attention to something. We need to control our background for our focal point or our subject to stand out. So what I'd like you to do is take some pictures, but thinking about what does the background look like, or the negative space, and seeing if it's distracting or actually helping bring attention to your focal point or your subject.